Okay, today we are going to be talking about writing a claim, and we are going to be focusing this activity on our interpretation of the catbird seat. My mind went blank for a moment. Okay, so we already talked about the title of this story, right? A literal interpretation of it as well as the metaphorical phrase, meaning to be sitting in a position with a position of advantage, I guess is the best way to say it. All right, so we are going to talk about claim writing. Throughout English classes, as English teachers, we've been using the word claim and thesis statement interchangeably. And I think for the most part, you can get away with that. The difference is that a claim is something that you would state about an informational text, whereas a thesis statement is something that you would make about a literary text. And so that's why, in Common Core standards, the two words claim and thesis statement are used interchangeably. In AP Lit, a claim is a part of a thesis statement. So what is a claim? A claim is a statement that requires defense with evidence from a text. A claim in AP Lit is part of the thesis statement. And then over here is the definition of a thesis statement. A thesis statement expresses an interpretation of a literary text and requires a defense through use of textual evidence and a line of reasoning, both of which are explained in an essay through commentary, also called analysis. I think on the AP rubric, it's called commentary. So the big thing to remember about this is that a claim is stating a position that you need to defend and argue. And all of this comes from the AP Lit standards. A couple of years ago, AP World kind of shuffled things around, particularly in AP Literature and Composition and AP Language and Composition. What makes the two English AP classes different from the AP classes in any other subject almost is that we do not have a specific curriculum that we must cover. So like in AP Statistics, the teachers have to cover all of this different curriculum. And that's why last spring, when COVID happened and schools were shut down, the tests all changed because there was a fear of a lack of equity in terms of if we can't teach the students this content, there's no way they can do well on the exam. And that's why in the spring, you noticed, if those of you who were in AP classes last year, the test was very different. And so again, this year with our remote teaching and with blended classroom happening potentially in October, AP teachers are concerned about not having enough time to cover everything that needs to be covered for the test. The AP English teachers, however, are not under that same stress because the AP English curriculum is skill-based. And so as long as the English teachers are covering those skills that are being tested on the exam, we're okay. I don't have to teach you book X, book Y, book Z, these short stories, these specific poems. We're going to read long fiction, short fiction, and poetry, as well as drama, and we're going to learn these skills through those texts. And so the first part of the year is looking at AP Literature Standard Language 1. Readers establish and communicate their interpretations of literature through arguments supported by textual evidence. And that's the basic literary analysis stuff that you learned how to do in 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade. A substandard is a skill connected to Lit Standard Language 1 is Skill 7B, and that is to develop a thesis statement that conveys a defensible claim about an interpretation of literature that may establish a line of reasoning. And this language is pulled right out of the AP College Board English Literature and Composition Standards. A lot of this language also shows up on the rubric for the AP exam, and a rubric that I use for our writing. All right, so the catbird seat. When looking at the role and function of characters in the text, what kind of claim or thesis statement can be created? Okay. When we begin considering writing a claim or thesis statement, typically the most obvious place to go is to the protagonist or antagonist, right? We want to look at those central characters because the story evolves around them. I have created an example of a marginal character because I didn't want to do the work for you, but I wanted to show you what it would look like based on that story. And so here's my claim thesis statement. Mr. Fitweiler, who exemplifies the stereotype of the older, gullible man, is easily swayed by superficial appearances in ways that prove detrimental to his business and his employees. Okay? So think about what I've written there and consider, am I making an argument? Am I showing my position on what I think about Mr. Fitweiler? Right? And if you say, yes, it does, then you are correct, because yes, I am saying he's that old man who is really gullible, and he got tricked by Mrs. Barrows and made her his special advisor. And because of that, he lost employees. He had to deal with this drama of the woman who went crazy, right? So the role of Mr. Fitzweiler, he is the boss. He's one of the owners of the company. The function of Mr. Fitweiler, how is he being used by the author in the story? He is the catalyst. If Mr. Fitweiler had not hired Mrs. Barrow, the story wouldn't exist, right? So it's because of Mr. Fitweiler. He is the one who opens that door to bring Mrs. Barrow in and to set up, unwittingly, of course, he didn't know this was going to happen, but he set up that conflict between Mr. Martin and Mrs. Barrow. Is my claim defensible? Am I stating a position that I can argue? Yes. What are my next steps? So I have a stance, I have a claim about the story. If I were going to then write a paper or an essay or an analysis of this story, the next step that I need to do is to collect evidence. And if I'm doing it right, I'm going to collect way more evidence than I'm going to need. Because the more you have, and you've got it all written down, and like I got this on page 2, I got this on page 5, once you have all that there, it's easier to say, nope, don't need those, but I'm going to focus on these, than to say, oh, I don't have enough, now I have to go back into the story and find more. It's time saving if you collect more than you think you'll need. So then we broke into small groups of 3 or 4 people in breakout rooms, and in those groups, the groups chose either Mr. Martin or Mrs. Barrows and talked about a thesis statement or a claim about either of those characters, and obviously the claim that would require defense through textual evidence. And then also I suggested that groups could begin looking for the textual evidence that would help you defend your claim. And so that was pretty much the bulk of class. We also talked a little bit about lit theory and criticism, how there are several of them that we will be studying throughout the year. They include historical criticism, feminist criticism, gender studies. We also look at Marxist lit theory. We look at post-colonialism theory, and we also look at deconstructionism. And so with that in mind, we could look at this story also through a feminist lens. When we look at a story through a feminist lens, we are looking at the traditional gender roles, the stereotypical gender roles of Western European white culture. And, how the men are the men who work, they work, they bring home the money, the wives stay at home. The wives are quiet or submissive. The men are the ones who are aggressive and loud. And then we can take that stereotype of the construct of stereotypical gender in white Western culture, and then apply that to the story and say, how does this story support these gendered roles, these traditional gendered roles, and how does the story kind of break apart these gendered roles? And we talked about how Mrs. Barrow doesn't fit into the traditional female role. She's a Mrs. Why is she working in a business? She should be home, right? She's also loud and aggressive, and that's typically considered a male behavior pattern. She uses a lot of sport analogies, which is also not feminine traditionally. And then Mr. Martin is the one who is more quiet and submissive and passive. And so as the story progresses, we see what happens when characters aren't fitting the traditional roles, right? Things begin to kind of fall apart. Mr. Martin is pushed to the breaking point. And then in the end, because Mrs. Barrows is behaving like a hysterical female, she is not believed. But Mr. Martin, who is the predictable, calm gentleman, is believed. And so there's an overlay of how gender is affecting what happens in the story, and then adding a deeper level of meaning to the text. So we talked about that in class 2. I love lit theory because it's just a really fun way to look at stories. You can look at the text, look at what it looks like on paper, look at character, plot, setting, all of that. And you can get a lot of meaning out of a text by just looking at the text. But when you enter into the text through another lens, it just creates all kinds of extra, for me, really fun and exciting layers to that meaning. And that is stuff that we're going to work with all year, which I'm really excited about. All right, then lastly, we ended class with a reminder to read that short story packet. Make sure you've read it all through by Tuesday. Make sure that you've completed the reading guide for one of those stories. And then we are going to get into groups on Tuesday and talk about story. And then we'll go from there and have a lot of fun next week. Okay? Have a good weekend, everyone.